PWHL Finals are underway. We have one game in the books, and there's a lot to talk about, even going back to the semifinal series. And we have a great guest to do it with us here today, Karissa Donkin from CBC Sports. We're going to get to as much as we can for you today on the Puck Drop podcast. Welcome in.
It's time for the PWHL Puck Drop podcast.
So welcome, Karissa Donkin. She is the CBC Sports Reporter covering the PWHL this season. So good to have you, Karissa. We've been wanting to do this for a while, and we have a lot to talk about. So welcome in today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Sure, I'm excited to talk to you. And first things first, I want to find out, how this all started for you. I know your background is as an investigative reporter, which is exciting. And then you got interested or started researching the PWHL when it formed, and so much so that you're actually writing a book about the league. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been a journalist for more than 12 years now, give or take, ballpark. And so I've covered all kinds of different things. As a news reporter, I've covered politics, I've covered crime, I've covered, been doing investigative stuff for the last 8 years. And I've always loved hockey. I've always loved women's hockey in particular. And honestly, this all started for me back in, during the kind of long days of COVID, when I was sitting around gathering dust and felt like I needed something to do with myself, and I needed a project. And I don't know, I just sort of thought, like, maybe I'll write something. And if I could write anything on the planet that might be a little different from what I was doing for work at the time, like, what would I want to write about? Like, what do I love enough to write about? And what do I feel could contribute something that's not already out there? And for me, I love women's hockey. I fell in love with women's hockey in 2002, the 2002 Olympics, obviously when Canada won that first gold medal. Like a lot of people,
it's right behind me. I'll always get this wrong, but and there's a reflection, but that's a number 22 jersey from 1998, signed somewhere by Wickenheiser herself. And I'm the same. That's my favorite team of all time.
That's cool. Now 98, obviously in Canada, we don't think about that one as much. 2002 sort of our year, but I don't really have a memory of the 98 Olympics, honestly. but 2002 for sure was one that's seared into my memory. Anyway, so I've always wanted to read a book about women's hockey. There are some great women's hockey books out there, primarily written by athletes themselves. Like Sammy Jo Small's book, for example, was one of the best sports books I've ever written. Highly recommended. But yeah, I just thought it would be helpful to kind of walk people through, like, how we got to this point. Like, the PWHL didn't exist then, but I thought that I could, kind of walk through the context of why women's labor in hockey has never been valued the same as men's. And I love sort of the sports documentary genre that's kind of blown up, where you sort of follow a season, right? And you follow a team over a season. And so I knew I wanted to do that. And I started kind of going to PWHPA showcases in like 2022, that season, and, talking to people and starting working on it. I didn't have a publisher at the time, but I knew kind of how I wanted to do it. And then sort of when this season started, I've been kind of following the Montreal team throughout the season, going there every month, and, sort of checking in with that team. And then in between, the book will explain the context of how we got here. And there's a whole long, wide, ranging road, as we know, to get us here. So that's sort of how I started writing about women's hockey. And then I started doing it for CBC Sports last fall, kind of when the league started. So I sort of worked on the book first. Then the book is completely separate from my work with CBC Sports. It has nothing to do with that. That's just something I do in my free time. And
side gig. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so that'll be out in the fall of 2025 from Goose Lane Editions, my publisher.
Awesome. And what's the title of the book going to be? Do we know yet?
Yeah, it's called Breakaway. And there's going to be a subtitle with it as well.
Yeah,
we're still working on that, but it's sort of, it kind of focuses on, like I said, that team in a year, and takes people inside that as much as possible, and kind of introduces them to some of the really interesting people in women's hockey, and then kind of explains the context around how we got here, because that's so important. So really excited to share it with people. I just think it's something that doesn't exist, so
yeah, no, I'm excited to read it, and I'm so happy that you took that on, and the timing is so interesting. This whole first season seems to have had so many fortuitous coincidences or timings for so many people, whether it was NCAA graduates uncertain where they were going to go, and then the league, and it happened so quickly that things like the project you just described that you were already working on probably took a pretty quick turn when you found out there was actually going to be, a true league joining, all the players that had been kind of separated, and, with the backing, and that it was going to be like a big new endeavor. So that must have been exciting, although challenging to turn that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, I'd already been kind of working on it for a couple of years, and with the idea that when this particular league started, I would follow a team. Obviously, I didn't know exactly when that was going to be. Like, we thought maybe it would be the fall after the Olympics, and that didn't happen. But yeah, for sure, it was one of those things for a long time that I've just been talking about to people around me for a long time. I'm working on this book. I promise I'm actually working on it, and then to find someone to believe in the project to publish it, for sure. I'm really grateful to Goose Lane for taking that on. So
that is amazing. I'm so happy. And the more female voices and writers, to me, there are some great guys and men covering the league as well. I'm not sure if female writers and broadcasters are still even in the minority, but as a female reporter and journalist writer, it's just great to have more voices. And I think we have a unique perspective, just being fans originally from way back, and then growing into it to see, the sides of it that we're privileged to see now. Like you have some insider stories to share. I'm sure that'll be really exciting to read. And so I'll put a link, and I'll, of course, when it comes out, be sure to help promote that on all the social media things. But do keep an eye out for that. If you're a fan, we have a great community here that has really supported the league and myself as much as I could have hoped for. So I'm sure that will be a big success. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. And, it's funny, like I used to read my grandfather's, hockey books when I was a kid, and I've got a shelf full of them back there, but most of them are written by men, and most of them are about men. Right. Yeah. So like, that's just it. I'm excited to get something out there that, tells a story that hasn't been told before, and from a female perspective. So
yeah, it means so much to have this representation. But let's segue into, talking some hockey. I think that's our favorite thing to do. And I want to start by just mentioning the finals, but I want to maybe work backwards, because I haven't really had a chance to dissect the semifinal series here on the podcast. I've been traveling and went to a couple of the games in Toronto. So right now we're at in between game 1 and 2 of the finals, and Boston, surprising PWHL Boston, has taken the 1-0 lead over Minnesota. What did you think of that first game, just in general, before we work backwards, but those two teams reaching the finals?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first game, obviously, I think the big story was like we were all talking about it's gonna be a goaltending duel, and because there weren't that many goals in the two semifinal series, and then that second period was wild, right? Like it was seven goals in the first two periods. Like who would have thought, right? Everybody was just. I think Courtney Kessel said in the press conference after, yeah, we've been saving them up. And that's been Boston's problem all season, and Minnesota to a lesser degree. But yeah, we certainly saw sort of a burst of offense, and I think just sort of the resurgence of Taylor Heisey. I mean, obviously we saw she scored those goals in Game 5, but that's the best of what Taylor Heisey can be. Like she has an incredible shot. She's such a playmaker. I think that's what we saw in January. That's what we saw a little bit in the preseason as well. And I think that is kind of a terrifying thought. I know Boston won obviously, but I'd be a little bit terrified about Taylor Heisey on a roll.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, those were definitely some storylines. With Boston, which I'm the worst at predictions. I'll just go ahead and say it. It's almost like if I pick you, you're doomed. But I did pick Boston to win the championship. I will say I picked them to finish first overall, thinking that would kind of go hand in hand. So I won't take credit for that. But, maybe I could still look wise in picking them as champion, which I did purely based on the draft and the roster that they assembled. At the time, it was, amazing that, somewhat fortuitous that certain players stayed eligible, available, but the talent on paper, the scooping up of Jamie Lee Rattray and Sophie Jaques and Alina Mueller coming to them at third, will say, it just seemed as though they had top to bottom probably the strongest roster on paper, but it didn't materialize in the regular season until the break. And Courtney Kessel did speak about that. I think I put a clip where she explained that the break really helped them just reset mentally, whether the players that went to the World Championships or the ones that stayed home. And so let's talk a little bit about their series with Montreal. I don't even know where to begin. So I already gave a preamble of how they got there, and maybe expectations were still cautious, but they looked like an oncoming freight train even at the start of that series. What were your thoughts going into that, and then as those 3 games unfolded?
Yeah, I mean, I think Boston for sure. I agree with you. I think going into the season on paper, like you look at how they did in the draft and just some of those like late round steals, like Sophie Shirley was an 11th round draft pick, or, to get Jessica DiGirolamo in the 6th round, and she's been so steady for them on the blue line. Like there were a few picks like that they made that you're like, that was a good pick. Like just up and down their draft. Like I think they had the best draft of all 6 teams. And I think a lot of people felt that way going into the season. And then obviously, like you alluded to, it wasn't clicking. I think maybe especially for some of the top players offensively, but then coming out of that break, it's like they were a totally different team, like just having a chance to step back and reset. I think they went into the playoffs with all the momentum in the world. I think Montreal had a lot of momentum too. They also had a really great stretch after the World Championship, figured out kind of the recipe for their power play, and things were kind of rolling. But yeah, I mean, I think going into that series, like it felt to me like a really even matchup. Honestly, all 6 teams this season, I think like anyone could win on any night. But those 2 teams in particular, both pretty physical teams, both going into it with a fair bit of confidence. I thought it was going to go 5 games. Like that was my prediction going in.
Yeah. And they had the final game of the season that I guess meant a little more to Boston than even we realized, although, they needed to win regulation to qualify, and they indeed did do that versus Montreal. And the coach alluded to the pulling of the goalie by Montreal, which say what you will. I think under normal circumstances, any competitive team would probably do that. But Boston took that as a sign of maybe, trying to get Boston eliminated or something. And so there was maybe a little bit of bad blood already between them. And like you said, the power play was clicking. Kristen O'Neill came back from the World Championship with a great head of steam. And who would ever bet against Marie-Philippe Poulin in any kind of showdown or, game with elimination potential? Certainly not me. And then we got what we got, which was, I don't even know how to put it. I did compare it to maybe a tennis match final where you won 3 straight sets in a tiebreaker. That's the only comparable I could think of. What were your observations watching those games? And
yeah, I mean, I think that's a great analogy, actually, the tennis analogy. I mean, it was so close every game, right? Like to have 3 games go to overtime, like 1 goal obviously could have changed everything. And it felt close. Like it's a 3-0 sweep, but it didn't feel like a 3-0 sweep to me. Like Montreal, I thought in the first game for sure was the better team, like wildly outshot Boston. And the second game, like triple overtime, you get to that point and it's like it could just go either way. And then the third game, Montreal was doing so well until kind of that last period, everything fell apart, right? So it's tough. I think that's the thing about a 5-game series. Like obviously we see the 7 games in the NHL, and to a lesser extent in women's hockey we've seen like a 3-game series or a 1-game decider. But a 5-game, it's longer, I think, than a lot of these players have had before, but it also goes by fast. Like you don't really have time to have a game off or, so I don't know. Like for me, a 3-game sweep doesn't really tell the full story, I think, of how close that series was.
Yeah, for sure. And, some of the storylines were, I'm assuming that you were a little bit leaning towards the Montreal side. I'm allowed to say, maybe you are not allowed to pick favorites, but being Canadian, I was hoping for a Toronto-Montreal final. So much for that. But
I'm neutral.
Okay, neutral.
I don't have an opinion. I don't have an opinion on who wins. Yeah.
And so like you said, in the first game, how frustrating for Montreal to do everything but win. So some confidence comes out of that in that they feel like they outplayed Boston, but to lose a game like that is heartbreaking. So then you go into a second game where maybe, it kind of similar, but as it became a marathon, another storyline emerged. I'll start with, to me, I guess the storyline right at the start was the goaltending choice of Coach Chevry to put in Desbiens. Now, that might not sound like a controversial headline or anything. She's got the pedigree, but Chuli had the 2 wins over Boston this season, and Desbiens had the 2 losses, with the caveat that the wins against Boston for Chuli kind of came in the middle of the season when Boston definitely was more downward. So it wasn't like a 1-for-1. But did you make anything at all, or would you have considered starting Chuli for Montreal in the first place, or gone to her for game 2 or even 3?
Yeah, I mean, I think she had a great season, obviously, for Montreal when she played. Like she came in and did, I think, everything that you could ask of a backup goaltender. She gave them a chance to win, I think, every time she was in net. But I don't think that was ever a consideration to not start Desbiens in those big games. Like that's where she thrives, I think, in her resume. And honestly, I mean, 3 games, she didn't play poorly, right?
Yeah.
I don't think she's the reason they lost that series by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't think it was ever a consideration to not start her. I mean, maybe if it goes, to a game 5 and then you go to a lengthier series, if they say they make the final, I could definitely see Chuli getting a game. And it's nothing against Chuli, fantastic goaltender, but I think that's Desbiens' net.
So in the second game that went to triple overtime, so that game went on and on and on, and maybe I'll let you explain what became a storyline there with the coaching decisions and maybe how that played even into the next game.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm on the Atlantic time zone, I should say. So that was a very late night. I'm so glad that was a Saturday, honestly. Late night for sure. Haven't been meeting my Apple sleep goals with these playoffs. I'm sure I'm not in the minority there. But yeah, I obviously I think the conversation has been around the usage of the choice to kind of play the top stars so much during that marathon game and some of the depth. I think it was the first game, the fourth line didn't play at all. And then the second game, they did play a little bit more, but obviously not as much as the top players. And so, I know that's definitely had a lot of traction, and it's tough, right? It's like going into overtime, you don't know it's going to go for 3 overtimes, right? So it's like if I'm in overtime and I see Hilary Knight coming over the boards, of course you're going to put out Marie-Philippe Poulin's line, and you want her on the ice anyway in those moments. Like she's like, who else on the planet would you want on the ice?
Just stay on the ice. Just don't even come off, even her at 50%, you would think, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. And poor Aaron Ambrose, who played, 61 minutes, I think, over it. But it's like, I don't know. And then you get to a third overtime, and if you have players who haven't really played a ton, and there were players who were worked in, I think, a little more over the overtimes, but some who hadn't played a ton, and then to throw them in cold, that's a difficult situation as well. And then say they're out there and they're out against the top line and they get scored on. And I don't know, it's a tough situation, right? It's like, if you don't have Marie-Philippe Poulin out there a lot during overtime, then people are like, what are you doing? Why is she not playing? She's the best player in the world. So yeah, it's like you get to triple overtime and it ends the way it does. And, I think in a perfect world, you definitely feel more comfortable with your depth to play them more often. Right. And obviously that didn't happen for whatever reason. That's something I can't explain, but you look at a team like Boston, and I think they drafted so well. They have had some injuries as well, though, getting a little better having Lauren Gable and Jamie Lee Rattray back for the final series. But, I mentioned a player like Sophie Shirley, who they got in the 11th round, right? Like you look at their draft, and I think they just drafted so well, and the free agents that they brought in, like they had the depth, and we've seen them shine throughout the series. So I think in Montreal, it's like you think of the players who were injured and unavailable, like an Anne-Sophie Bataille or a Kennedy Marchment.
And Dominika Leshkova right at the start of the season, I think was pretty much a devastating injury for that lineup.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, or Sarah Bougeau, who had been great on the third line all season, or sort of in that kind of role, also played a little bit higher as well. So I don't know. I mean, it's a tough one, right? It's like it didn't go that way, but it was so close. Yeah. So
hindsight, of course, you can say, yeah, I'm sure if knowing as a coach the game was going to go into triple overtime, you might have, made some decisions differently. But yeah, but it certainly gave us a lot to talk about and write about as far as, the questioning or defending or comparing. And as you just spoke about the depth, which I think has become more and more of a storyline for all of the teams, we'll get to the Toronto series in a minute, of course. And, things that were unexpected just seem to be the norm. It's, just been exciting. But those were, as you said, not really like a 3-game sweep. I wish we could have had further games, because it did seem like Montreal ran out of gas maybe a little bit when Boston was able to come back in that third game. And shining our spotlight on Susanna Tapani, who scored the 2 overtime goals, was just incredible. Really, really happy for her. And foreshadowing, don't worry, we will get to this, because the trade between Boston and Minnesota has actually really come, under a spotlight. But first, let's just cover the other. And if I don't remember these, Karissa, please remind me to get back to these things that I'm teasing, because I'm mentioning a couple of things. But So the other series between Toronto and Minnesota, of course, they selected Minnesota, which some people came, to kind of hold over them afterwards. But the choices were either, like we talked about, kind of the hard charging Boston team or a Minnesota team that literally backed their way into the playoffs, not qualifying through a win of their own, but through the lack of a win by Ottawa. So Toronto did choose Minnesota and looked like it might have been the right choice, at least in the first game and even into the second game. And I was there for those 2 games in Toronto. The atmosphere was great. They switched to Coca-Cola Coliseum, and it was so funny. You go through the crowd and say, who's going to win and who do you think's going to score first? And the answers were pretty much universal. Toronto's going to win and Natalie Spooner is going to score the first goal. And that's indeed what happened. And it was looking like easy streets. And then they went to Minnesota, and maybe through my tears, maybe you can pick up the storyline at that point and kind of describe how that series unfolded.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the first 2 games, it looked like Toronto was maybe gonna, sweep Minnesota. And I think going in, choosing between Minnesota and Boston, like you said, it's like, are you going to pick the team that kind of has been on a hot streak, has all this momentum going into the series, is the more physical of the 2 teams in Boston, or are you going to pick maybe more of a skilled team in Minnesota that had been on that 5-game losing streak? Though I think it's safe to say that those 5 games, like, that's not really what Minnesota has been about all season. Like, every team has kind of had a bit of a skid at some point, and Minnesota's, unfortunately for them, happened kind of at the worst possible time as they're trying to clinch a playoff spot at the end of the season. But they're certainly better than those 5 games are, as we saw when they, came back. And in that game 3 at home, probably Toronto's worst game of the year. I think head coach Troy Ryan, after that first period, I think it was Toronto had 2 shots on goal.
Yes, I think it was 11-2.
Yeah, and it didn't look like Toronto, right? And then you go into game 4, that game that, we all sat there for 5 periods waiting for somebody to score a goal. And, it was, kind of a bit of a slog, I think, is the safest word we could use for it. And Claire Boudourac comes out as the hero in double overtime. And then game 5, Toronto looked a lot better. But it's like, I think, again, with these short 5-game series, like, Minnesota's got some momentum. They've got their confidence back. Like, I wonder how much coming back from Worlds, and, so many of those players didn't come back with a gold medal. They lost in the final to Canada. And then obviously somebody like Grace Zumwinkle goes and doesn't even get to play for Team USA as a reserve, despite the great season she's had. So I think, got a bit of confidence with those 2 wins at home. Toronto's a little bit shaken, hasn't really had a setback like that, I think, in a little while. And then obviously, unfortunately, losing Natalie Spooner too, like, such a huge part of their team on the ice and in the locker room too. But, like, to only score 1 goal in 3 games, like, that's, you can't win a hockey game if you don't score goals. So
yeah, I agree with everything you mentioned. That was a turning point for sure when Maddie Rooney came in and pretty much turned the tide, by just standing on her head. So it was shutout, and then 4-1 in the final. I mean, it was tight going. And I know in the post series or post season chat that Troy Ryan mentioned, he thought the series was actually lost in game 3. They did lose game 4 and 5, but he really thought if they had taken a better stranglehold at the start of game 3, they had the momentum. They had Minnesota really feeling the self-doubt and, could have finished it. And as a player's coach, of course, he takes it on himself that he didn't have them as prepared as they should have. And interestingly, he even said if they had been playing differently, he didn't even think that play where Spooner got injured would have unfolded the way it did, which I thought was really interesting. She was killing a penalty and kind of ragging the puck, skating back in her zone, and looked almost ready for a line change and collided or got hit. So that was an interesting take, I thought, and not wrong that that by allowing them to get that little bit of belief in game 3, you could see it on their faces that they were like, oh, okay, now we remember who we are. Kendall Coyne is just, she is so determined. I would not want to go against her either in any kind of a series. So it was really a mental battle and a goaltending battle, wouldn't you say? Those, and both coaches coached great, made adjustments. I think it was everything we could have asked for in a series, really. Full 5 games and all kinds of storylines.
I agree with you. And just like like we were talking about with Montreal too, I think like those momentum swings, especially when you've got 2 great goaltenders, you've got skill on both sides and stuff like that, and some of that's canceling each other out. I think that's when you have a momentum swing like that, if you can't kind of get it back right away, I totally see what Troy was getting at there. Like they got some confidence and they kind of ran with it.
Yeah, it started to slip through their fingers. The Toronto crowd was great, and I'm allowed to be subjective or non-objective, and it was great to see the support in Toronto this year, and would have personally loved to see like either of the American teams against either of the Canadian teams. I think would have made for a great final, just to have some of those players again head to head, whether it's, Spooner, Turnbull, or, Poulin, Stacey on one side, and Kendall Coyne and Heisey, or Knight and Keller, or I think that would have been really cool. But the finals are the 2 underdog teams, surprisingly, and I hope I haven't missed anything that I said I'd mention, but we'll try to cover, and I'll rely on you to remember. So we'll get to the finals. We've got 2 teams that were a little bit unexpected, although, it's not like an underdog in a 32-team league like the NHL, where it was so surprising. Any of the 6 teams really could have emerged, but Boston continues to charge, and Minnesota looks like they are over their speed bump. And so what are some of the storylines in the finals for you as we dig into this hopefully long 5-game series?
Yeah, like you said, like there's so much parity in the league. Like if you told me that, Ottawa made the playoffs and they're in the finals, I'd be like, yeah, that checks out.
Yeah,
like they've been, I think, a better team than perhaps the record has shown this year. But yeah, I mean, I think, like we talked about earlier, that it was going to be a goaltending duel coming in. And I know the first game was pretty high scoring, but I do think that that's going to be a storyline throughout the series. Like Erin Frankel, what is it they've been calling her? The big green monster?
The green monster, because
the green
of
monster.
The wall, yeah.
Yeah, she's not very big, honestly. She's not the tallest goaltender, but yeah, like she's been incredible. She's for sure was the reason Boston won that first game against Montreal, I think. And even in the third period of the first game against Minnesota, like when they were pushing, she was steady. That second period was crazy, but and then on the other side with Minnesota, they've just had such a great kind of, 1A, 1B tandem situation all season. And Maddie Rooney's kind of taken the net, but Nicole Hensley could come in at any point, and I think you could be confident that she could, hold her own. So, I mean, there's definitely that. And then looking at, it's just the stars on both sides, like you talked about Kendall Coyne and, the leadership that she brings. And then you look on the other side at Hillary Knight, and she hasn't, been scoring the big goals at this point. But she's sort of been playing maybe a grittier style of hockey.
Yeah.
And I would never, rule out a big goal from Hillary Knight. Like history shows that she can turn it up a notch when it matters. And then I think it's just, the depth as well, like depth, obviously, when there's stars on each team, and the way that the draft and free agency and everything was set up, I think, when you have 6 teams that all have the same resources, essentially,
Right.
it really comes down to like who did the best job scouting in the 10th and the 11th rounds, and who did the best job in free agency and stuff like that. And both of these teams, I think, we saw Minnesota's depth come up big, like Claire Butorac scoring the game winner in double OT against Toronto. And then obviously we've talked about the depth in Boston as well, like somebody like Amanda Pelkey just stepping it up and scoring a couple of big goals. She's been scoring big goals against Montreal all season long. Ruined their home opener for them as well.
That's right.
She's got a thing. Maybe it's Vermont, like a Vermont connection. I don't know. But anyway, so that's it, right? Like it's the depth. I think that, is going to probably matter at the end of the day. And then obviously, Taylor Heisey, like watching what she can do. Can she keep it up? I mean, she's a gamer. So
yes, maybe we just say a word about her coming to life. She did have an injury early in the season. Maybe that has played into it, or maybe just the mental strain down the stretch. But I think she is. I'm trying to scan the Boston side. I mean, other than Tapani, who suddenly became the overtime hero, but in all seriousness, I think Heisey is the one real X factor, and she showed that by scoring the last couple of games. And when she's on the ice, it's not quite to the Poulin like level, but she can circle. She looks so dangerous. I think opponents really aren't sure how to handle a player like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that goal that she scored on the power play against Toronto, like, I mean, that's like, it was an incredible shot, right?
Yeah.
And she can shoot like that. Like she has the skill to shoot like that. And like you said, she did have an injury coming out of the rivalry series, like earlier in the season. I thought she looked pretty good going into the World Championship too. And then just like coming out of the World Championship, Minnesota had a bit of a struggle. But yeah, like Taylor Heisey, I think is a game changer. And I think like having this confidence in her first playoffs, I think she can do a lot. I think she's someone who I'm interested to see what else she can do in this series. Grace Zumwinkle is another person who I think has had a bit of a quieter playoffs, but like just her drive to the net, her ability to do that as a power forward, like I think that her game is well suited for playoff hockey. So she's someone that that you can't really count out as well.
Right. And let's touch on, there's another player, as I was watching Toronto versus Minnesota, Sophie Jaques to me was a threat and, showed why she had won the Patty Kazmaier and was a scary player to be hoping would not score, if I could say it that way. And so that is a really interesting storyline in that Boston and Montreal had the first trade of the PWHL ever to end the season. Susanna Tapani going from Minnesota to Boston for Sophie Jaques. And now here they are in the finals. And I would say the trade worked out well for both sides. And both players are really, have played important roles for their teams.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I chatted with both GMs after that trade back in February. And so from Boston's perspective, like their biggest problem all season long, which I think came as a surprise to a lot of us, was that they couldn't seem to score goals. So one thing that they noticed was they weren't scoring the first goal, and they were losing a lot of games by 1 goal. So GM Danielle Marmer, she's looking at her roster, and that's the question, is how can we be 1 goal better? And so she goes out and she acquires Susanna Tapani, and she gives up, someone in Sophie Jaques who she says, like, I know this is a special player. She's going to be a fantastic player. They were having trouble kind of getting her in the lineup, and it maybe wasn't the best, fit for her in terms of where they were slotting her in. But obviously, knew that she is going to be a great player. They're giving up a great player, but bringing in Susanna Tapani, like, it's just fit like a glove, right? She scored some, 2 overtime game winners against Montreal, and just kind of been that, I wouldn't even say depth scoring. I guess she's top scoring.
Secondary scoring, maybe.
Secondary scoring. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. And, you can never have too many centers. And so that was something, like, in talking to Danielle Marmer, like she said, maybe it seems a little impatient, but she wants to win, right? Like, she's a GM in Boston. They love winning championships in that city, right? So, and then from Minnesota's perspective, Natalie Darwitz. So, as a coach in Minnesota, like in college hockey, she saw Sophie Jaques up close and personal, right? Playing against her team with Ohio State, and been being, as you said, a kind of a scary player. And so she knew that if they could put her in the right situation where she, feels comfortable, there are one or two of her Ohio State teammates, like Liz Sheppers is the one that comes to mind immediately, who she immediately gets to play with, and put her in the position to succeed. And I think that she's done that. I mean, she's been fantastic. She's going to be a great player in the league for years to come.
Yeah, and she made the, I think, smart play on the overtime winner that Minnesota got in that double overtime. In my mind, she shot it wide on purpose. I mean, I don't think she misses the net by 4 feet. Otherwise, I think that was maybe a set play or just something that, she had seen work before, how it bounced, and you create chaos in front, and, that's just a smart play. And so both of those players, we won't say single-handedly, but, their name on the score sheet is right there on the overtime winning goals for their teams, literally propelling them to wins in these shorter, 3 wins and you're done. So that is really interesting about Danielle Marmer. She's a smart GM, and they both, I think that was a great deal. It's nice to see a hockey deal, as they call it. We don't usually get those on the, that other league where salary cap and draft picks and things come into play. But they both had said they didn't want to just trade, a player further down the roster and make them change cities and so on and so on. Just kind of to test it out. They wanted to make a deal that would be important if they were going to uproot those players. And that was interesting as well. And just, all part and parcel of what makes the PWHL so different and interesting on those levels. Well, we'll call that a wrap then. Hopefully, if there are any more storylines, we'll be able to talk about it in upcoming podcasts. So it's time for our much beloved by those who know it segment known as 6 in 6. And
next up,
here's the jingle.
6 in 6.
And usually we do something around the 6 teams. So we've decided to do the upcoming draft for the 6 teams and call on Karissa's insider knowledge of what the teams might be eyeing, or at least what their needs are. And you might even have to help me remember the order. This is how muddled I am. So
no, it's okay. It's regular season.
Yeah, it's regular season, and we know New York, finished last and even, won the gold plan, points as it unfolded. So PWHL New York will have the first overall pick, and their needs in your eyes and even who they picked would be?
Yeah, I'd say probably scoring. There's a few different things New York needs. I mean, they don't have a starting goaltender signed for next season. Not that they're going to address that with the first overall pick, but there are a few different holes there. I think they need to get better defensively, though they do have, a great young core, and Ella Shelton, for one, who I think will be one of the best defenders in the world here in a couple of years, if she's not already in that category. Mm-hmm. So all of that is to say, I think they're going to draft Sarah Fillier because she's she's a generational player. She can score. She's been playing on the wing this season in Princeton, which is probably a bit of a terrifying thought for people who have to play against her. So she's just trying to make herself more of a Swiss Army knife, and just, she thinks the game at such a high level. I'd be shocked if they took anybody else.
Agreed. I think that's pretty much the consensus. I mean, yeah, surprises can happen, but I think they need a lot of just improvement overall. So why not take the best player available, right? So at number 2, finishing 5th is Ottawa. So what do you see their needs being, and would that translate into a name that you want to give us, or just a general overview of some possibilities there?
Yeah. I mean, I think in Ottawa, they prioritize defense in their last draft. So they've got somebody like Ashton Bell as a young defender to be there for the next couple of years. I think they're obviously set with a starting goaltender. So I say they take Danielle Serdachny, somebody who can score, but is also a bit of a playmaker as well. And you can never have too many of those type of players. I mean, you don't know yet if for sure if you have somebody like Daryl Watts coming back. And if you don't have her, I think that creates a bit of a hole on your, I guess is technically your second line. So I think Danielle Serdachny to Ottawa, and someone who has some familiarity with some players on that team like Brianne Jenner and Emily Clark from Team Canada. We certainly saw the thing about Danielle Serdachny for me is her confidence. So it was one of the rivalry series games that I'm blanking on, not this season. It was last season. And, yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm getting at. So she looks off Poulin. Like how many college players look off Poulin? Like she just had the confidence to shoot that puck and she scored the game winner. And then obviously scored the gold medal, winning goal in overtime. So I think somebody like that who's a bit of a game breaker and who sees the ice well, that's something that Ottawa could use.
Nice. I really like that. There's so many good names, in a first round that only has 6. I love Serdachny's game. You're right. She's very confident, and I think she'll make an impact right away. So then drafting 3rd overall, help me out, is
Minnesota.
Okay.
finishing 4th. So I know that sounds
drafting 3rd. Yes. So the 2 teams in the finals, they're not reordering them. They're going by the way they finished. So Minnesota in that spot, what do you see there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw in the last draft, like I mentioned, there was a huge run on defenders, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that again because I think, we look at what Montreal had to give up to get a second pair defender and Amanda Boulier at the trade deadline. Like I think that's still kind of in short supply around the league. So I don't know. I think they're going to take Kayla Barnes, right shooting defender. Has offensive instincts, I think, adds a bit of a different kind of element. I mean, obviously you have Sophie Jaques, who's also kind of in that mold. You have somebody like Lee Steckline, who's, kind of the veteran you can throw on the penalty kill and whatnot. I'd say they take Kayla Barnes. That's my guess there. But a Hannah Bilka is somebody I could see there as well. I mean, both of those players would be familiar to a lot of the players on that roster from the U.S. national team. Kayla Barnes has been playing there for a few years. And, they could always use more scoring as well. That was a problem in Minnesota this season a little bit, scoring multiple goals a game, I think.
Right.
But I'd say they take Kayla Barnes. That's my guess.
I would agree. So far, I could totally see it unfolding this way. And I think just as a, there seems to be something to the idea of the Canadian teams taking Canadians and American teams taking Americans, whether it's just familiarity, like you said, or just, wanting to build an identity, and players that know each other and GMs that are familiar gives just, a tiny edge right off the bat, although next up would be Boston, finishing 3rd and therefore drafting 4th. Right. So we've got another American team here at this spot. What do you see as their draft needs?
Someone who can score goals, I think. Offense was the issue in Boston this season, which I think was a little bit surprising when you look at their personnel. But, I think that I think they had a pretty solid blue line this season. I would say they target a forward. Maybe that's Hannah Bilka. Maybe it's, we haven't seen the draft declaration list yet. So maybe there'll be a big forward who will declare who they draft. So Ian Kennedy with the Hockey News reported this weekend that Amanda Kessel is declared for the draft. Of course, we haven't seen the list yet. If she's out there, I could see her going to Minnesota 3rd. I could see her going to Boston 4th. Obviously, we haven't seen her play this season, but we all know what she can do, and I could see her going in the first round if she's available. If not, I could see somebody like a Hannah Bilka. I could maybe even see somebody like a Julia Gosling. Like, she's somebody we don't talk about a whole lot, but I think she is going to be, like a Natalie Spooner type of player down the road. I think she was kind of sneaky solid for Canada on the 4th line this year, and she's been part of their program for a long time. She was centralized for the last Olympics, didn't end up making that final roster, but she's got she's got the size, she's got the smarts. And so she's somebody who I think is a bit of an underrated player in this draft. So I think Boston goes for somebody who can score.
Right. I would, Amanda Kessel could be a wild card, but I think it would be really hard to pass up Hannah Bilka if she's there in that spot for Boston. So if I were penciling it, that's, going with what you selected so far. I think if Bilka's there, but you're right, there are a couple of names that, depending where they see them fitting in the lineup, makes a difference as well. So let's move to Montreal, who finished 2nd. And so they will have the 5th pick. And as you said, I won't foreshadow your choice, but Montreal had a tough time in the blue line, so I would imagine that you see them looking for a defender.
I think the ideal, perfect dream head in the clouds scenario, maybe it'll happen for Montreal, is Claire Thompson at 5th overall. So obviously we know Claire Thompson can play beside Erin Ambrose. They won a gold medal together. For folks who have been following the PWHL this season, maybe you've heard of Claire Thompson as a reserve player with New York, but she wasn't able to play because of she didn't have the right visa. She's a student visa, not the ability to work. And she's in medical school in New York. So that's the reason why we haven't seen her, and, didn't know if she was going to be playing in the league at all, or if she was going to be playing in the near future, obviously, as she's, going through medical school as a super smart person. But she's somebody who, obviously is just a very smart player. And we know that she has offensive capability. And like you said, that comfort level, I think is something that teams take into account. But, she's somebody who Corey Chevry will be really familiar with from Team Canada as well. So I just think if she's available at 5th overall, that's a steal, and they're going to take her.
Yeah. There's going to be such an impact from all of these players in the first few rounds. It's just amazing. And I think you're right. I don't necessarily think it's head in the clouds. I think they would be over the moon, if that's the right.
Yeah, I was going for some sort of space metaphor there. That probably wasn't the right one, but like a dream, jump on your rocket ship and sail to the moon. And
shoot for the stars. Yes.
Shoot for the stars. That's what I'm going for. Thank you.
I think you might, I think they might get their wish because of the names that are a little bit ahead. And yeah, I think that would just be such a beautiful fit, as you said, with Ambrose. I would sign up for that any day to go see them play in Montreal. And so our final team on the board, having the 6th pick from finishing first, is our own PWHL Toronto. And I'm looking at my list. Things work out nicely for the way I've penciled it. But what do you see, Karissa?
Yeah, Toronto, I don't know. I think they obviously have the best D pairing in the world in Renata Fast and Jocelyn Larocque. But I think a little bit more defensive depth wouldn't hurt there. But I could also see them taking a player like Julia Gosling, who we know Gina Kingsbury knows a lot about. And she could be, like I said, somebody who is that kind of Natalie Spooner type of mold of player. with the size that she has, with the smarts that she has. And, someone Troy Ryan obviously is familiar with as well. So I don't see them leaving her on the table if she's available in the first round. But I mean, yeah, there's all kinds of different options that they could go with there. I wouldn't be shocked at all to see a run on D in this draft again. We haven't talked at all about some of the players coming over from Europe, but somebody like Ronja Savalainen, who is, just a sturdy, solid defender with the Finnish team, has been great with the top team in the SDHL, Swedish Women's Hockey League, for a few years. Maybe she doesn't go in the first round, but I think she's going pretty soon in the second round. She's, a veteran you can bring in. And that's the unique thing about this draft, is that obviously it's the entry point for top young NCAA talent, which you have a double whammy of this year, I think, because of that extra eligibility that players had with the pandemic. But then it's also your entry point for talent from Europe. So there's so many exciting players in this draft. And I think, we're talking about what teams need and stuff like that, but I think teams are going to look very different next year. There's a lot of players on one-year contracts. There could be a fair bit of movement, and players will have more control over where they find themselves this season. So it's such an exciting draft. I think it's going to be really fun to watch.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Just as you were saying that, and I was eyeing my list a little bit, and it played out pretty much as you laid it out. I was wondering how the American teams would target those two, but the perfect answer is that Serdachny goes second to Ottawa, and then everything falls into place. So well done. And then that would leave Gosling for Toronto in my book, which would be wonderful. And then I wonder if in the second round is where the teams just say, okay, let's just knuckle down and get our defenders. And maybe there's, the Pesova and Savalainen and Nyland Pearson. Those names might start to go. I think that looking into my crystal ball is what I'm looking for. Maybe something like that plays out, unless some crazy thing happens and they all grab them in the first round and leave some of those other names on the table. Who knows? But
yeah. And there's nobody who knows, the Czech national team better than Carla McLeod, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously brought in Katarina Mrazova this year and had a ton of success with her.
Yeah, like I said, they were building a mini Czech team there, mini corner of the world, which is interesting to see. Gives every team a type of identity, and that's not a bad one to have at all with that nice group of players there. Well, we will wrap it up. I think we've got a lot of information to digest, and we're still in the thick of the finals, but please join us again, Karissa. Hopefully before the draft, maybe when we do get the declarations, or to wrap up the finals. Hopefully you would be up for that. It's been just great having you on. Thank you so much for the time and for all of the great insight. And again, your book, Breakaway, subtitle about the formula of the PWHL, will be coming out, and we'll put a link to that and keep folks updated.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's just so great to see so much excitement, so much interest in women's hockey this year. And for folks who haven't watched it yet, I think it's such an exciting game, and I hope they tune in. It's been a privilege to cover it.
Yes, I agree. It's been wonderful. And after the draft, we'll go through a long summer before we get back to some more excitement. But there's plenty to do, and yourself maybe doing book promotions and things. But we'll certainly watch for your work on the CBC website, and hopefully rejoining us again on the podcast. Thanks again, Karissa. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
PWHL Puck Drop Podcast.